July 7th, 1944, 4:45 in the morning. The island of Saipan, in the Marianas chain of the Central Pacific, lies still beneath a sky not yet brightened by dawn. The jungle smells of rot and cordite, of salt wind off the sea, and the iron-copper scent of blood that had been soaking into this volcanic soil for 3 weeks. The Tanapog Plain stretches north along the western coast, a narrow corridor of flatland pressed between rugged hills and the dark face of the Pacific Ocean. Coconut palms stand shredded by artillery. The ground is churned to mud. American foxholes dot the line. Soldiers press low, rifles resting across sandbag lips, eyes wide in the darkness. And then, from somewhere in the black space to the north, a sound begins. Not rifle fire, not the crump of mortar rounds, something else entirely. Something that raises the hair on the back of every neck along that thin American line. Singing. Thousands of voices, ragged and low, then rising. The sound of men who have already said farewell to the living world. Men who have drunk their last measures of sake and beer. Who have wrapped their wounds in cloth and strapped bayonets to bamboo poles because the ammunition is gone and the rifles have been lost. And who have been told by their commanding general that there is, in his own recorded words, only one. Truth remaining, that in death there is life. The singing moves like a tide through the darkness, growing louder, spreading wider, until it is not sound anymore but pressure. At 0445, they came. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito would not be among them. The day before, on the evening of July 6, he had issued his final order, a jokusai, a term that the Japanese soldiers in the Imperial Army understood in their bones to mean something beyond a charge, beyond a last stand. Jokusai translated, literally, as the smashing of the jewel, an order that could only be issued by Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, an instruction not to fight for victory, but to die in a manner so violent and so complete that the sacrifice would carry meaning beyond the individual. Saito had told his men, gathered in their thousands at the northern tip of the island, that whether we attack or whether we stay where we are, there is only death. However, in death there is life. He had then committed seppuku in his command post, a ritually correct ending for a general who had run out of war. His men had not run out of conviction. They had only run out of everything else. What followed on that pre-dawn plain would become the largest banzai charge in the entire Pacific War. But to understand what stopped it, what actually turned the tide in that desperate morning on the Tanapag coast, one must go back not to a battlefield, but to a factory floor in a small town in western Pennsylvania. Back 4 years before that morning. Back to the beginning of the strangest weapon the American military would ever field. Butler, Pennsylvania. September 1940. The American Bantam Car Company was not a great industrial power. It was, by any honest accounting, a struggling concern. A manufacturer of small, light automobiles that had spent most of the Depression era fighting for financial survival. Its factory in Butler sat between farmland and rolling hills, far from the forge and steel thunder of Detroit. When the United States Army issued a specification request in the summer of 1940, circulating its notice to 135 automobile and tractor manufacturers across the country, nearly all of them ignored it or declined. The requirement seemed almost absurd. The Army wanted a four-wheel drive reconnaissance vehicle weighing no more than 1,300 pounds, capable of climbing grades, fording shallow rivers, and carrying a machine gun and a crew of soldiers across any terrain on Earth. And it wanted a working prototype delivered within 49 days. Only one company answered with any serious intent. Only one company built the machine from nothing and delivered it on time. That company was American Bantam, and their creation, a squat, blunt-nosed vehicle barely 11 feet long and 5 feet wide, riding on tires no larger than those found on a farm truck, would become the most consequential military vehicle of the Second World War. Soldiers who first saw the prototype could not quite decide whether to laugh or be impressed. It sat no higher than a man's chest. Its hood was flat, its windshield folded forward, its flanks open to the weather. Against the towering tanks and half-tracks and artillery pieces being assembled in the arsenals of the world's great armies, it looked, as more than one observer noted, like something designed for a child. A toy. A machine whose smallness seemed to argue against its own seriousness. But the Army had asked a very specific question with its 1940 specification, and the Bantam prototype answered every one of those questions with precision. It could climb a 60-degree gradient. It could ford water nearly a foot deep. It could carry a crew and a mounted weapon across terrain that stopped heavier vehicles cold. Its four-wheel drive engaged without ceremony. Its engine, modest as it was, proved utterly reliable. When Willys Overland and Ford were brought in to manufacture the design at scale, producing what became standardized as the Willys MB and Ford GPW, the quarter-ton truck became the vehicle that the United States sent to every theater of the war. Over the course of the conflict, more than 639,000 of these machines rolled off American assembly lines. Willys alone produced 363,000. Ford manufactured 280,000 more. They went to North Africa and Italy, to France and Germany, to New Guinea and Guadalcanal in the Philippines. They were shipped to the Soviet Union by the tens of thousands under Lend-Lease. They carried generals and ammunition, radio operators and stretcher cases. They were fitted with machine guns and radio equipment and stretchers and rocket launchers. They went everywhere the war went, and they went there faster and more reliably than anything else on four wheels. General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, and the man most responsible for shaping American military strategy, called the Willys Jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, who had seen the conflict from North Africa to the Pacific, wrote in a 1943 dispatch that I don't think we could continue the war without the Jeep. It does everything. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, reflecting on the tools that had carried the Allied cause to final victory, counted the Jeep alongside the Dakota transport aircraft and the landing craft as one of only 3 machines that had genuinely won the war. And yet, in the summer of 1944, on a small volcanic island 1,450 miles south of Tokyo, that assessment would be tested in a way that no planner in Washington had fully imagined. The Jeep would not win that particular morning with its speed, or its durability, or its capacity to carry supplies across difficult terrain. It would win it with a single .50 caliber machine gun mounted in its rear, and with one man standing upright behind that gun, refusing to come down. To understand what Lieutenant Colonel William Joseph O'Brien was defending, one must understand what Saipan meant in the geometry of the Pacific War. The Marianas Islands lie in a rough north-south chain in the Central Pacific. They had been Japanese territory since the First World War, mandated by the League of Nations and subsequently fortified with airfields, harbors, and garrison forces. When American planners looked at the map in late 1943 and early 1944, they saw something that the Japanese leadership also saw with considerable anxiety: that whoever held the Marianas controlled the airspace over the Western Pacific. The island of Saipan sat precisely 450 miles from the Japanese home islands. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, America's new long-range heavy bomber, had a combat range of roughly 1,600 miles. The mathematics were not complicated. If the United States took Saipan, the home islands themselves, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, the factories and the shipyards, and the population centers that sustained the entire Japanese war effort, would come within direct bombing range. The Japanese understood this. Their strategic designation for the Marianas was Zatai Kokubkan, the absolute national defense zone, a line that could not be surrendered, a perimeter beyond which the empire's survival itself was not guaranteed. Admiral Soemu Toyota, commanding the combined fleet, called his ships and carriers to sea in June 1944 to stop the American landings. The resulting naval battle, which American aviators would name, with unsparing humor, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, resulted in the destruction of 3 Japanese fleet carriers and nearly 600 aircraft in 2 days of combat. When it was over, Japan's naval aviation had, in practical terms, ceased to exist. No rescue would come from the sea. When the Marines and soldiers of the U.S. landing force came ashore at Saipan's southwestern beaches on June 15, 1944, they faced a garrison of approximately 30,000 Japanese troops under General Saito, fortified across 3 weeks of mountainous, cave-riddled terrain. The fighting was some of the most savage recorded in the Pacific. The Americans advanced yard by bloody yard through ravines and ridges, through cane fields and jungle, against defenders who had been told explicitly that capture was unacceptable and retreat impossible. 3 American divisions were committed to the island: the 2nd Marine Division, the 4th Marine Division, and the Army's 27th Infantry Division, the latter a formation that had begun its existence as a New York National Guard unit and still carried, in its ranks, an unusually large contingent of men from upstate New York. By the evening of July 6, 21 days after the initial landings, the battle had compressed the surviving Japanese into the northern third of the island. Their backs were against the sea. The naval relief they had been promised would never come. Their air cover had been annihilated. Their supplies had been cut. In the darkness of that last evening, some of the exhausted soldiers at the northern tip of the island were armed with nothing more than sharpened bamboo poles. Others carried bayonets stripped from rifles that no longer had ammunition. A Japanese prisoner interrogated by American intelligence that day described a mass attack coming within hours, using a word, gyokusai, that a small team of Nisei American intelligence specialists immediately recognized as categorically different from any assault the Americans had yet encountered. The head of that intelligence section, Lieutenant Benjamin Hazard, tried frantically to convey the distinction to his superiors. The word did not mean a charge. It meant an annihilation of oneself deliberately as an offering. They know they're going to die, Hazard remembered trying to explain. They come in singing. You could hear them in the distance, singing. His superiors did not fully understand. The line was not reinforced. What the 2 forward battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment, the 1st and 2nd Battalions, faced at 0445 on the morning of July 7 has been described by every survivor who recorded his testimony in similar terms. Major Edward McCarthy, commanding the 2nd Battalion, said it looked like a cattle stampede from a Western motion picture, except the Japanese just kept on coming. Lieutenant Morris Seriton, the heavy weapons officer whose machine guns tore into the first waves and still could not stop them, said later that it was chaos unable to describe. Between 3,000 and 4,000 Japanese troops, the final military force remaining from a garrison that had once numbered 30,000, came down the Tanapag Plain in the darkness, screaming, singing, surging through a gap they had found between the 2 American battalions. The American line broke. It did not simply bend and flex under pressure. It shattered, dissolved into fragments, into isolated pockets of men firing in every direction as thousands of attackers flowed past them and between them and around them. The 27th Division's artillery fired 2,666 rounds in the first hour alone. Marine howitzer batteries behind the line depressed their barrels horizontal, firing 105 Mimi shells at point-blank range directly into the advancing human mass, converting the great cannons momentarily into outsized shotguns. And still the tide came on. It was in these minutes, as the battalions dissolved, as men ran out of ammunition and used rifle butts and then the rifles themselves as clubs until the stock splintered, as the wounded were carried and then dragged and then left with a pistol and a cigarette against a tree, that lieutenant, Colonel William Joseph O'Brien, made his decision. O'Brien was 44 years old. He had been born in Troy, New York, had served in the same 27th Division during the First World War, and had come back to lead its men in this second and larger conflagration. He was, by every account of the men who served beneath him, exactly the kind of officer who refused to accept the arithmetic of defeat. When the attack burst through his line and his battalion's positions began to crumble, O'Brien did not retreat. He walked up and down what remained of his perimeter, a pistol in each hand, shouting at his men to hold, calling to them by name in the darkness, telling them in language that left nothing to interpretation, "Don't give a damn inch." A Japanese bullet struck him in the shoulder. He refused evacuation. A medic bandaged the wound as O'Brien continued firing. When the ammunition in his pistols was gone, he took a rifle from a wounded soldier nearby. When that too was emptied, he turned and saw, sitting silent in the chaos of the plain, an abandoned jeep. The machine was 11 feet of steel and rubber, barely chest high to the man approaching it, looking in that moment of extremity like a piece of farm equipment that had wandered onto a battlefield by mistake. But mounted above its rear was a Browning M2.50 caliber heavy machine gun, a weapon capable of firing 600 rounds per minute, a weapon whose half-inch projectiles could penetrate the light armor of vehicles, could tear through the densely packed formations of men surging toward the American position with devastating efficiency. O'Brien ran to the jeep, climbed into the rear, and stood upright behind the gun. His Medal of Honor citation, composed after his death from the testimony of those who watched him, records the moment with the compressed economy of official language. When last seen alive, he was standing upright, firing into the Japanese hordes that were then enveloping him. That phrase, standing upright, carries more than it appears to. It was not tactically necessary. It was not safer than crouching behind the gun's shield. It was a deliberate act, a physical declaration made to every man on both sides of that exchange. He was seen. He chose to be seen. In a landscape of bodies and chaos, and the enormous sound of thousands of men dying, the small jeep became a fixed point, a platform no larger than a child's imagination of a vehicle, with one American officer standing straight above it, dealing out consequence at 600 rounds per minute. When O'Brien's ammunition finally ran out, the Japanese overran his position. His body was found afterward. Around the jeep, the American soldiers who recovered the scene counted the dead. At least 30 Japanese soldiers lay within the immediate perimeter of O'Brien's last stand, killed in the minutes he had held that gun in the darkness of the Tonopah Plain. Lieutenant Colonel William Joseph O'Brien was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor on May 27, 1945. He was one of 3 men of the 105th Infantry Regiment to receive that distinction for their actions that morning. Private Thomas Baker, who had used his rifle as a club until the stock broke and then asked to be left against a tree with a pistol and 8 rounds, and shot 8 Japanese soldiers before he died, also received it posthumously. Captain Benjamin Salomon, the battalion dentist who had volunteered as a surgeon and who died at a water-cooled machine gun with 98 Japanese soldiers dead around him, received it in 2002, nearly 60 years after the battle, after decades of advocacy by surviving witnesses. By 1800 hours, on July 7, 1944, the American forces had retaken every position lost during the morning assault. The battle for those positions had cost the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment nearly everything. 406 men killed, another 512 wounded, the 2 units effectively ceasing to exist as combat formations. The Japanese had lost 4,311 soldiers in the 12 hours of the Jokusai. The jewel had been smashed. But the smashing had accomplished, in military terms, precisely nothing. Saipan was declared secure 2 days later, on July 9. Within weeks, American engineers were constructing airfields across the island's terrain. By November 1944, B-29 superfortresses were lifting from those fields and turning their noses north toward the home islands. The bombing campaign that would ultimately break Japan's capacity to sustain the war had begun from exactly the ground that 4,000 men had died trying to defend. In Japan, the news of Saipan's fall was devastating in ways that transcended the military. The island had been publicly presented to the Japanese people as an unassailable fortress, part of the inner ring that stood between the nation's heart and the enemy's reach. Its loss forced the government to acknowledge, for the first time, that the war was not going as described. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, whose personal prestige had been bound to the promise that the inner defense zone would hold, resigned from office within days of the announcement. The Jeep, meanwhile, did not pause for any of this. It continued doing what it had always done. It carried dispatchers and ammunition boxes across terrain that trucks could not navigate and tanks considered beneath notice. It transported wounded men from forward aid stations to field hospitals along roads that were barely roads. It was fitted with stretchers, with radios, with rocket tubes, with recoilless rifles. Young PFC. Harold Agerholm, 19 years old, found an ambulance jeep in the hours after the Gyokusai and drove it repeatedly through Japanese-held territory to recover wounded men he had never met, until a sniper's round ended his life, and the Army counted 45 American soldiers alive because of his circuits in that small machine. Agerholm, too, received the Medal of Honor. There is something worth observing in the contrast that the jeep represented on that morning and in all the mornings like it. The Japanese Imperial Army had invested its final hours on Saipan in an act of ritualized destruction, ordered through the most sacred channel of imperial command, steeped in the ancient vocabulary of samurai sacrifice and the Bushido principle that death honorably chosen erases the shame of defeat. It was, by any measure, a serious act, performed by serious men who held those beliefs with complete conviction. General Saito had knelt and committed seppuku in his command post. His soldiers had drunk their sake and strapped bayonets to bamboo and walked singing into American fire. They had expected to die, and they had died exactly as expected. What they had not expected, what their ideology and training had given them no framework to account for, was an 11-foot American machine, left sitting unattended on a coastal plain, suddenly manned by a wounded colonel from Troy, New York, who climbed into it the way a man climbs into. Something familiar, something ordinary, something that is simply available and useful and does not require ceremony to operate. The Jeep had no ideology. It required no oath, no sacrifice, no philosophical architecture of death and honor. It was a product of American industrial pragmatism born in a struggling factory in western Pennsylvania, designed by engineers under a 49-day deadline, manufactured by the hundreds of thousands in plants that ran 3 shifts around the clock because the American economy, vast, adaptable, and powered by something the Japanese high command had persistently underestimated, could produce such things in quantities that defied the imagination of those who had built their strategy on the assumption of American softness. It was small enough to seem inconsequential. That was precisely the point. The Tanapog Plain was quiet by evening on July 9, 1944. The battle for Saipan was over. The island's northern cliffs would claim more lives in the days that followed, as Japanese civilians, convinced by imperial propaganda that American soldiers were incapable of mercy, chose to step into the air above the sea rather than accept the surrender that American loudspeakers were, broadcasting impatient Japanese across the water. That horror belongs to a separate accounting. But here, on the coastal plain, the accounting was complete. The Jeep sat somewhere in that landscape, unremarkable. If it survived the battle, it would have been refueled and returned to service. It would have carried supplies and men across the island in the weeks that followed, as engineers and construction battalions moved in and the airfields began to take shape. It would have looked, to any casual observer, exactly like what it was: a small, functional, unromantic machine, indifferent to history, requiring only fuel and a driver. But there is a truth embedded in small things that only becomes visible when they are measured against the large events they survived. General Marshall was right when he called it America's greatest contribution. Not because it was the most powerful or the most lethal or the most technically sophisticated weapon in the American arsenal. It was none of those things. He was right because the Jeep was the instrument of a particular kind of abundance. Not the abundance of wealth alone, but the abundance of an idea. The idea that a free people, given the materials and the time and the necessity, could produce not one extraordinary vehicle or 10 or 1,000, but 639,000 of them, and send them to every theater of the war, and fit them with whatever the moment required, and trust the men behind their wheels to use them as the situation demanded. Lieutenant General Saito had told his soldiers that in death there is life. He meant it in the spiritual vocabulary of the Bushido tradition, that a death given freely in service to the emperor carried its own form of continuity, its own form of honor that outlasted the individual. But on the Tanapog Plain, in the pre-dawn darkness of July 7, 1944, a different proposition was being tested. Not the proposition of meaningful death, but the proposition of improbable survival. A wounded man, A borrowed machine, a gun that was still loaded. The choice, made without ceremony, to stand upright. The empire sent its final jewel to be shattered against that choice. And the jewel shattered, and the empire cracked along the fracture, and the child-sized jeep sat in the afterward with its gun barrel cooling in the Pacific morning, as ordinary and as undefeatable as the people who had built it. The war did not end that morning. It rarely ends in a single morning. But something did end. Something in the arithmetic of what could be endured and what could not. In the calculation of what an ideology built on magnificent death could accomplish against a people who had decided, with the same quiet stubbornness that builds small cars in Pennsylvania and sends them across the world, that the work of living was worth defending. Freedom, in the end, does not always announce itself with the language of monuments and ceremony. Sometimes it sits 11 feet long on a coastal plain, smelling of gasoline and gun oil, waiting for whoever is willing to climb in and stand up.